The error paid no attention to anything around him, even the sight of Slenderman putting Coz in a chokehold with his tentacles, and began to think instead. The error was still processing its next plan, and for now that was all he could do. In fact, the error was so preoccupied with its thoughts that it didn't notice when a fourth figure stepped through the ripple in the empty space. The error's eyes looked up and met another pair of eyes. Unlike its own red eyes, this figure had blank white ones. Finally. Notch almost forgot to duck down when a blast of black static flew at his face. Notch and the Mojang crew were fighting alongside Notch's entire army. As Notch dived down to dodge the blast, it whizzed over him and connected with the back of the hallway behind him. He watched in horror as his throne of white wool was disintegrated while everything else around it was set on fire. This aggravated Notch completely and he whirled around, lashing relentlessly into the neck of the plasma blob in front of him. The Ether Palace was being attacked by swarms of black plasma masses sent by the error itself, and as soon as Notch had seen the end of the main hallway explode he knew that the error was barely being contained anymore. Notch was ripped from his thoughts when a zap of black static smacked him in the chest, and he was knocked backwards onto the ground. Another plasma mass towered over him, ready to suck him into a mini black hole. But Notch had barely opened his eyes after the impact before he saw a diamond pair of shears, mod, pass over him and lodge itself into the plasma mass, cutting it down to molecular pieces. The diamond shears flew backwards over his head and heard the grunt of someone catching it. Notch quickly stood up and smiled when he saw a stocky figure running up to him. "Thanks, Mutton Chop. I'm glad you decided to come," he remarked. Mutton Chop was a faithful warrior of Notch's who was the head commander of the sheep squad. He was a sheep-dyed cyan who stood up on its hind legs like a human. He looked just like a regular sheep in general except for the fact that he was standing up and that he was wearing a diamond helmet. Notch looked down at the diamond shears in Mutton Chop's hands. "Oh, so you've brought out Shred for the occasion? That old girl hasn't seen a battle in hundreds of years," murmured Notch. Mutton Chop hurtled Shred to his left and it sheared the skin off a nearby plasma mass, leaving its exposed white fleshy underarmor. The plasma mass was embarrassed enough to flee the battle scene, and when Shred flew back into Mutton Chop's hand, Mutton Chop turned back around and grinned. "Right, that is, mate. But this old girl is plenty capable of skinning the likes of any mobs around here, or any other scum for that matter." Notch grinned himself and replied. "Good thing too, these viruses won't let up. Ha." A mass of black plasma had leapt over Mutton Chop completely and almost tackled Notch to the ground, but he stabbed his diamond sword upward at the precise time, impaling the virus and destroying it into another million black pieces. Notch heard a shout from behind him and whirled around to see Steve running up to him as he was being chased by a small group of viruses. Notch gestured for Mutton Chop to come forward and the two banded with Steve to help fight off the group. Using Steve's and Notch's diamond swords and Mutton Chop's diamond shears, they had reduced the group of plasma masses to nothingness. Notch took the short opportunity to run down the shattering hall to fight alongside the rest of the Mojang crew. Even though his castle was being destroyed, Notch had always loved a battle that pumped him up with adrenaline. In fact, he laughed heroically as he jumped into the midst of a battle going on between Jeb and two other viruses. Norman woke up to hear a scuttling noise. He jumped out of bed and looked around, but didn't see any creepers approaching. Eerily, in the dead of night there were no monsters in sight at all. Not a few seconds had he stood up did he notice that everyone in his group was gone, poof, vanished. Then he felt something bite him in the neck, and he yelped out in pain but then was knocked out cold by the amnesia-like poison. Once again Norman woke up after having a dreamless sleep, only this time he woke to the sound of about a couple hundred pairs of scuttling legs. He tried to get up, but then he noticed that he was wrapped inside some kind of cocoon of sticky silk. Norman couldn't find Shatter at all near him, and he had to tear at the silk with his bare hands. After a matter of minutes, a hole in the silk opened, and he poked his head through. Norman was inside a gargantuan cave, and when he looked behind him he could still see the plains. But inside the cave, cobwebs lined the walls and ceiling. Hundreds of spiders were crawling everywhere in the cave, on the walls and ceiling too. He was in a monstrous spider nest. Norman panicked even more when he saw that he was being carried towards two giant vats. One had lava bubbling over. Norman could tell something wanted them for dinner. As Norman tried to look around some more, he gasped in pain. He put a hand to the back of his neck and recoiled, touching the bite marks that he had received from the spider. Using the least amount of movement possible, he looked forward to see more spiders carrying bundles of spider silk. Their entire team had been captured. Norman knew that he would have had to find a way to the next clan, but being kidnapped wouldn't have been his first choice. Norman looked behind him again to see if he could escape out the entrance, but spiders were crawling in so many places you could barely see the floor. Norman lifted up his arm and looked at his hotbar. It was completely empty except for 20 pieces of glass that he had left over from who knows what. There was only one thing he could do, and Norman took action immediately. He quietly tore open the rest of the silk cocoon and jumped off the spider's back onto the ground. It whirled round and made one of those strange scratch-hissing noises, then bared its fangs. Norman jumped up onto a pillar of glass until he was 8 blocks high, then speedily built a glass box around him. At least 30 spiders were now pursuing him, and all of them climbed onto the glass box. After about 10 seconds, Norman couldn't even see anything except for a bunch of spider abdomens. Spider noises pounded through his ears, and that was all he could hear for a few moments. Norman searched around his blocked view and found a small hole in between two of a spider's legs. He could just see inside the dim cave, and his entire group was still trapped inside cocoons. Norman reached behind him, but suddenly realized that the spiders had taken his block pack too. Norman didn't have any glass left, so he was completely out of supplies. With all the spiders swarming around on the glass, he might just have had to sit there until he starved. Norman peered hopelessly outside of the tiny hole of space while his friends were being carried away towards the 2 vats of bubbling liquid far ahead. Normally, he had some kind of plan or he could come up with one, but his situation was completely hopeless. Norman knew that the only thing he could do if he didn't want to die was sit there and wait for the Spider Clan's mutant to come and attack him. He watched as his friends were brought over and were carried up onto the edge of the first vat. The spiders then flipped onto their backs and landed in the oozy batter, submerging every one of his friends. This went on for about 5 seconds, but then the spiders climbed back out and headed over to the other vat. Norman suddenly realized that everyone was being transformed into deep-fried treats. Norman wanted to kill the spiders as they lined up one by one over the vat of lava. One jumped into the lava and deep-fried his friend in the batter, but in the process the spider died, and another one had to carefully reach in and take out his dead companion. Norman had a sudden thought that burned through his head like fire. What if that was Lizzie? Or Jeff? Norman was so helpless, he could only yell and scream at the spiders. At one point Norman smashed his fist hard on the glass in front of him, when all of a sudden all of the glass shattered at once. Norman gasped when he saw that he was standing in a box of cobwebs now and he wasn't falling through. Also, the spiders were getting stuck and they were barely moving at all. Norman looked over at the spiders again, and his breathing became shallow as another companion was deep-fried by the lava vat. Norman knew he had to try and use his powers, and he punched away the one cobweb in front of him and thrust his arm towards the spiders surrounding the lava vat. He saw a single cobweb appear where the spider coming next was, so he made a circle with his arm and the whole ring of spiders were stuck in cobwebs. 10 of the 30 spiders were nearly fallen through to kill him, but he took action and punched away the spiders near the hole in front of him. Evidently, he was able to walk right through the cobwebs at a normal speed, But suddenly he felt his sores and bumps from traveling seem to wash away when he was inside the cobwebs. You know, maybe this power has its uses after all, he said to himself silently. Norman jumped down and laughed to himself as he ran across the cobweb floor while sprinting, and his hunger didn't even go down. He sprinted right up to the vat where the immobilized spiders were almost into the vat. Norman knew he had to replace the lava with something, so he did something huge by placing a cobweb over every lava block, extinguishing it entirely. Norman gasped as he dropped to the ground from a sudden exhaustion. Okay, so these powers have their low points too, he said to himself silently again. The hundreds of spiders in the cave were now coming towards him, and suddenly Norman found himself looking up. As soon as he did, he found out what kind of errors the spiders were getting. About 40 or so spiders were slowly descending down from the cave ceiling, a fine stream of cobwebs appearing from their behinds. Norman shuddered for a moment, and when he looked down at the bottom of the vat, all of the hundreds of spiders were climbing up to kill him. Norman immediately put a thick layering of his own cobwebs around the two vats, and then jammed all the spiders above him with more. This drained his energy considerable, and his arms and legs suddenly felt weak. He was brought back to his senses quickly when he heard a ripping noise. He straightened up and saw a great mountain of wild red hair coming out of the batter-soaked spider cocoon nearest to him. Lizzie crawled out and fell to the ground with a gasp, and then she looked up at Norman and sighed quickly. That was so gross. Norman pulled her to her feet and looked up. The spiders were slowly starting to come down, and he was forced to put down the bunch more to slow them down. Norman looked behind him and saw a couple of spiders were nearly up onto the vats. Norman instead put a half-sphere of cobwebs around their entire group. Not even a second after Norman fell to his knees from exhaustion, breathing in shallow reps. A chorus of ripping noises occurred at that moment, and Norman managed to raise his head to see everyone in his group coming out from their silk cocoons. They still had about 20 seconds before the spiders would be upon them, so he did a head count while Danny took charge and started digging down into the stone for them to make an escape. Norman suddenly realized something: they had to do one more thing if they wanted to live while he was performing the head count, and his weak hand grabbed Danny's arm that was nearly out of reach. Danny. Replace. Cobwebs. Bedrock. He muttered. Danny grunted and raised up his arms, instantly replacing all of the surrounding cobwebs in the entire cave. Norman just meant the protection around him, with bedrock. Danny immediately fell flat on his face and started snoring, right on the spot. Norman put a hand to his forehead and muttered. Idiot. Norman finished the head count, partly distracted from the wave of spider noises coming from behind their protection barrier. He gasped helplessly when he realized which of his group had been sentenced to a fiery death. Before he could even form the name in his head, he heard Jeff cry out from the other side of the vat. Esmeralda! Esmeralda! Esmeralda, where are you? Esmeralda! Esmeralda! Chapter 21, Revenge. Even in his complete exhaustion, Norman thought to himself that Jeff couldn't possibly take much more depression. He was right. Jeff completely shut down after realizing that Esmeralda, his only family member, had left. As the last of their group began to dig a staircase down into the stone of the cave, Jeff followed slowly from behind, dragging his iron sword with a blank expression on his face. Norman had ordered the group to start digging down underneath the cave in hope of finding all of their stolen supplies, weapons, armor, and food. After that, they'd have to find the Spider Clan's mutant. After much complaining and yelling, they were forced to dig down through the stone with their bare hands, and the only way they could make it faster was to each work all at the same time. Norman didn't have any food to regain his strength, so he also stayed behind and pretty much crawled down the steps going into the earth. After getting his needed rest from the previous ordeal, Danny kept trying, muttering prayers to Notch for them to find their things quickly, but somehow he always managed to turn them into threats instead. The group was digging down for the longest, most boring hour of their lives, but finally after that long wait a hole opened up in the next level down. Being leader, Norman slowly and pathetically crawled over and looked down into the hole. Before he even got a chance to see what was down there, Danny decided to be clever and kicked Norman in the butt, making him fall down into the hole. Norman grunted when he hit the stone floor, which was 10 blocks below, only relieving him of more energy. He sat up and muttered some very unpleasant things about Danny under his breath before looking around. He was in a 10 by 10 room of pure stone. 2 torches lit the walls on each edge of the square room, and when he looked near the back he saw many chests lined up against the wall with a couple of furnaces mixed in. Norman heard a thud from behind, and he scooted away from under the hole, seeing that everyone else was jumping down to meet him. Danny was the first down, and he smirked at how helpless and weak Norman looked. "How was the fall, noobman? I hope it didn't hurt too much." Norman didn't even feel like retaliating. He crawled over to one of the chests while ignoring Danny completely, and miraculously inside was all of their food supplies. Norman chomped down on 3 pork chops to restore his hunger bars, and after a few seconds or so he began to feel less tired. By the time everyone had jumped down into the hole, Norman had gained back enough strength to stand. He took this opportunity to snatch shatter back from a different chest and whack Danny over the head. That felt good, he thought to himself. Danny was about to strangle Norman, but Quinn stepped in and held up his arms. "Dudes, keep your cool." "Shut it, you dirty hippie," Danny retorted. With his newfound strength, Norman ordered everyone to each take a chest and its supplies. He did not. When someone, Danny, complained that he wouldn't be carrying anything, Norman explained why. I know, but the Spider Clan's mutant will probably be coming after me since I'm the leader, so I'm not thinking it would be best to leave me with anything important, alright?" After all of the chests and furnaces and supplies had been stored away, Norman cleared his throat for everyone's attention again. As he slowly walked towards the group to make himself visible, he said, "Okay, now that we've got our stuff back, I say we start tunneling." But before he could even finish his sentence, Norman stepped on a stone pressure plate that no one had noticed. He heard the sliding of pistons, and suddenly the entire floor opened up, sending them down into a dark hole. Most people either screamed or flailed around while falling, but then suddenly everyone was stopped by something soft and sticky. Everyone except for Norman, who fell right through the unknown substance. Norman landed instead on a stone pillar that just happened to be below him, and when he looked down he gulped and nearly lost balance. Below him was a large flat area of glass with pistons around the edges, and on the other side of the glass was about 100 or so spiders, all hissing and spitting at him. Norman looked up and suddenly met a bright light. He could now see that his friends were all stuck in a thick jumble of cobwebs, only they weren't moving at all. Norman hadn't become stuck because of his block power, and at that moment he actually thanked Boris for giving him the block power of cobweb. Norman found that he could see very well through cobwebs at will, and when he looked through the barrier trapping his friends he saw that they were in a small room, only 25 by 25. Norman wanted to get out of there quick, so he did the jump-up pillar method, making a pillar of cobwebs all the way until he was standing atop the jumble of cobwebs. He wasn't sure how, but he willed the cobweb trap to become solid for him, and he quickly went about and freed everyone. As he came to Danny, he paused for a moment and smiled. Danny stared menacingly at him and said, "You melon-headed freak, you'd better free me up, otherwise I'll rip you apart in a second." Norman continued to smile and said, "I seriously doubt that. Maybe if you weren't in such a, sorry, bad pun, sticky situation, you'd be able to hurt me. Then again." Suddenly, Danny's look went from angry to scared. He stared right above Norman's head and his lip quivered. Norman saw this and muttered, "What?" Suddenly, he felt something like pincers clamp around his neck and he was hoisted into the air. Gasping for breath, Norman turned his head frantically and met not a bear but 8 giant glowing red eyes. At that instant, the random light that filled the room extinguished, leaving Norman to stare at the glowing red eyes for even more intense moments. Suddenly, the monstrosity hissed like a spider, only 20 times louder. The light in the room flickered rapidly, turning from bright to dark, confusing Norman's eyes completely. On a strange note, Norman could even hear suspenseful background music coming from out of the walls. Using the flashes of light, Norman quickly backed up and stared at the giant spider before him. He was facing a spider that stood 5 blocks tall and was 10 blocks long and 7 blocks wide. The spider mutant had 8 legs that were 3 times longer than they should have been at 7 blocks long each. From underneath they stretched out and swapped at their group, who had begun to fight. Norman ran forward and jumped up, thwacking the spider mutant in one of its eyes. Instantly, the eye he had hit hissed and extinguished its light, leaving the spider mutant looking like it only had 7 eyes. Norman then thought to himself, "Bailey, now would be a good time to start shooting its eyes out." Bailey. Oh no. Norman had completely forgotten about the other victim of the deep frying, and he had to wipe his eyes for a few seconds to prevent himself from crying. He had gone to the trouble of talking with Bailey about her life for nothing. He was able to come back to focus when a giant blackleg swept him off his feet, sending him into the wall. Norman gasped and yelled out in pain, but he quickly healed himself with a pork chop. Norman jumped back to his feet and saw that someone else had knocked out the eye opposite of the one he hit. The spider mutant retaliated by climbing up the wall at supersonic speed, so that it was a blur of black and red. Norman watched as the creature made its way onto the ceiling in under a half a second, and it dropped down on top of Hillary, who barely managed to hurl himself out of the way. The spider mutant got up just as quick and repeated this, climbing up the wall in record time and trying to squash its victims. Norman had never seen anything move so fast, and now it was nearly impossible to slow the thing down. "Wait a minute. I can slow it down." Norman raised his hands up towards the spider just as it fell off the ceiling, and it slowed down instantly, barely moving inside its cluttered barrier of cobwebs. This hadn't trained Norman very much, but he still ran forward. Norman jumped up and jabbed shatter into another of the spider mutant's eyes. It hissed and spit slimy saliva, which thankfully turned out to be non-toxic. Norman hit another eye, and when he glanced over his shoulder he noticed that everyone was watching him. Unfortunately, that quarter of a second cost him greatly, because the spider mutant dropped down on top of him and pinned him down to the ground. Norman held up his arms above his head as the spider mutant used its front 2 legs to bash him up at an extremely rapid pace. Norman couldn't protect against this, and he felt a crack in his back. Suddenly, the whacks turned into whips. Every rapid slap of the spider's legs were sharp and painful, and Norman could feel gashes forming in his back. Suddenly, the spider jerked to a stop, frozen in mid-whip. Norman painfully lifted his head and turned it to look at the spider mutant. He saw Jeff standing atop the spider with 3 swords stabbed into every one of the spider mutant's eyes except the large middle one. His expression looked deadly as he said, "This is for my son Jonah and wife Esmeralda who had to suffer because of the wrath of the error. All of you mutants will die. The Nether is your only home, you damned creatures. I will not let you kill any more." Jeff let out a terrible yell and pulled out a 4th sword, which he thrust down into the spider mutant's final eye. Norman's stomach lurched when he saw the blade go down through the spider's skull and out the other end, spilling a blob of spider guts, which unfortunately spilled all over Norman's shoes. The eye remained flickering red for a few seconds, but then it faded away. The spider mutant let out a screeching hiss and then fell to the ground with a thud, right on top of Norman's already scarred back. Norman gasped in pain as Danny and Hillary rolled the giant spider mutant's carcass off of his back. Norman felt someone slowly feeding him some cooked chicken, and he looked up to see Stephanie Flowerpot kneeling over him. Norman felt his gashes begin to seal up and heal, but when they were done he could still feel a dull burning sensation. Norman stood up shakily and asked someone to place down some torches. He then wiped the spider guts from his shoes. After the room was properly lit, anyone in the group who wasn't badly injured replaced all of the cobweb floors with glass. They still needed to see down where the spiders were being kept from them. When Norman took a glance downward where the sticky pistons and glass were, he saw that the spiders were still trying to get at him. The spiders must have been smart enough to find an alternate path to get to them. Norman just assumed that they were down there for extra violence if needed, but the spider mutant had died before it could see the spiders loose. Lizzie walked up to him once the floors were completely glass and held out something in her hands. Norman took it and gathered everyone around to see. It was the spider mutant's doorway drop. The drop itself was very boring in appearance, really. It looked like a long and thick pearl-colored black. Norman then realized that it was one of the spider mutant's legs. He tried placing it on the ground, and he gasped when it appeared. The leg was still intact at 7 blocks long, but it sat completely still on the ground. Norman had a sudden idea and sat on the spider mutant leg, and he had barely even leaned forward when it shot in that direction at supersonic speed. Norman hollered like a cowboy and performed a fake twirl like he was using a lasso. He rode around the room at twice the speed of someone sprinting for a few seconds, but then straightened his back, and the spider leg stopped. On a humorous note, the spider leg moved like in the same motion as an inchworm. Norman hopped off and the spider leg fell flat on the ground. He wanted to know what it was called, so he quickly took the golden eye from his block pack, which he found in one of the chests from earlier. He looked into the golden pupil and saw both the name of the doorway drop and the mutant. After taking a glimpse, he turned to the group who were waiting impatiently. "Well, we just faced the Spider Clan's mutant, which turned out to be named Tangulera. Also, Tangulera's leg is just called Tangulera's leg, so that'll be easy to remember. Unfortunately, we still have to get rid of those spiders down there. Man, I wish Bailey were here, then she could just have the mecha creeper blow up the whole cave," said Norman. Suddenly, a dull explosion occurred from far away, somewhere above them. Everyone paused. "What was that?" someone muttered. Again, a boom echoed from somewhere distant, but this time it sounded closer. Norman looked at the wall above where they had fallen through the floor. Suddenly, a third explosion occurred, and the floor above them broke open, raining down much rubble and debris. Norman held his arms over his head and coughed a few times before looking back up where the explosion occurred. Suddenly, a face appeared from up above. "Hey guys. Come up here." Blackberry blasted us a way out. It was Bailey. Norman's mouth hung open slightly and for a few seconds he was silent. Bailey waved her hand and beckoned them again. Norman looked around at the group, who were all either sighing with relief or letting out tears of joy. "All right, everyone. Apparently, Bailey is still with us. Everyone can use their block's powers to jump up and out of here. You all know the jump-up pillar method, right?" Using the jump-up pillar method, everyone in the group ascended up on their own blocks, except for Stephanie, who had to share with Hillary because of her flowerpot powers. Once they were all up, Danny closed up the hole with bedrock so no one would fall in again. Norman saw Bailey standing there with a grin, and Butterball was scratching his back on the stone wall. He rushed over to Bailey and said, "Bailey, how did you survive that lava deep frying? And where did Butterball and the mecha creeper go?" "Well, it's kind of a long story," she murmured. "It's morning now, but last night I heard a scuttling kind of noise, and when I woke up I saw a giant army of spiders coming in from the east. I woke up Butterball and Blackberry and we put some distance in between us and the camp. I also took the time to find Hillary's pets, because they were also getting nervous and moving around. We watched you guys get carried away, and we followed behind the spider army until we reached the cave. I knew I had to come and save you guys, so I snuck around back of the cave and had Blackberry blast our way down. Eventually, we found this room, and we heard some yelling from underneath the floor, and then we blasted a hole through. There you have it, she explained. Norman furrowed his eyebrows. Who's Blackberry? Bailey turned around and pointed upward. Norman looked up and gasped when he saw the mecha creeper staring down at him with its two giant eyes through a giant hole far above, blocking most of the sunlight. Still, one was smashed looking and the other was perfect. It took him a few seconds to understand, but when he did he stared at Bailey. You named the mecha creeper Blackberry? Of all the names you could pick, like Death Blast or Flame Burst, you picked Blackberry? Nothing else crossed your mind, nothing at all? Bailey shrugged and said. I think it's okay. Sorry I didn't ask. Norman held his forehead and rubbed it to relieve an oncoming headache. After grumbling a few times, he breathed heavily and gathered his group's attention, leading everyone to the hole. All right, let's get out of here, he declared. The entire group made their way up through the uneven hole, jumping and climbing the distance. After about a minute of jumping, they emerged into the sunlight of the day. The sun was just above the horizon. Hillary was very glad to find all his pets safe and sound. Norman paused for a moment along with everyone else, almost absorbing the sunlight. Norman's chest swelled and he took a deep breath of clean air. Only for a moment though, because at that moment he found himself with a mouthful of water. Norman choked and coughed, and then looked up after parting his drenched hair. He saw Blackberry, the mecha creeper, sitting waist-deep in a nearby lake, soaking itself. Norman looked back at everyone else groaning and holding their sodden clothes. He again glanced at Blackberry, who was staring at him. HSSSSHH, HSSSSHH, HSSSSHH. When Norman realized that it was laughing at him he muttered. Very funny, you oversized rust bucket. Chapter 22, The SOSKG. Norman quickly located Jeff, who was leaning up against the stone wall of the cave nearby. Jeff glanced up at Norman and muttered hi. Norman nodded and tried to put on a smile, but it ended up looking kind of weak. Jeff? I don't know what to say about what's happened, but I'm really sorry about Esmeralda. Jeff sighed, held his head, but then he replied saying, It's all right. When we were fighting Tangela, I knew what I had to do to avenge my family. The rest of the 3 mutants that are left will also receive the same fate for their cruelness. A silent moment went by, but then Jeff looked up into the clouds and smiled. Only his smile wasn't a sad smile, it actually looked happy. You know, Jonah and Esmeralda might have suffered here in the overworld, but now that they're up in the ether with Notch they won't ever suffer. Even if the error destroyed the ether palace like the monster it is, I'm sure that Notch will make sure that they are kept safe. He murmured. About 5 seconds of silence went by. Norman felt bad about everything Jeff was going through. If he had lost 2 family members within 2 weeks, he'd be completely shut down. Norman then admired how strong Jeff could be even in the worst of times. Jeff must have been tired of the silence, so he nodded at Norman and said, All right, we'd better get moving. If we're going to find the rest of these mutants, we're going to have to kick it into high gear. So Norman quickly gathered up their group of 9, not including Butterball and Blackberry, and then they were off in the blink of an eye. It didn't take very much time for Norman and company to reach the village, which happened to be a mere 100 or so blocks from their position. Norman really had no idea whatsoever what to do, so he just began to wander farther into the plains at random, followed by his group. The village was a tiny little area of only 4 structures and a well, and it was positioned near the border of a jungle. The houses in fact were also quite small. They entered the puny village and it seemed completely deserted. There were no people around, no sounds came from the houses. Norman even saw a tumbleweed block, mud, drift by lazily. Suddenly, Stephanie spoke up from behind. "Well, we might as well see if anyone is in their houses." Norman looked around again at the deserted mini-village. He shrugged and murmured, "Okay." They entered the village and squeezed their way through the 1-block pathways separating the 4 mini-houses. As Norman came closer to the houses, he realized that they were all identical, but only 3 by 3 by 3 each. Norman shrugged to a lot of strange looks, and he led them to the door of the bottom left house. Norman opened the door and found only a torch and a chest. Norman looked inside the chest, but there was nothing. So, they moved on to the house next to it. The result was the same. Finally, after checking the 3rd house, which was also vacant, they checked the final home in the top right. Norman opened the door and checked the chest. It was empty. For a moment, Norman wondered what the point of the puny village was, but suddenly he noticed something inside the chest. As he was staring, Danny yelled impatiently from outside to him. The entire group couldn't fit inside well enough. "Hey! You almost done in there?" Norman looked down into the bottom of the chest, ignoring Danny, and his eyes widened. The bottom of the chest was cut off, and a hole went down about 5 blocks into the ground, lined with ladders. "Hey guys! I found something here." "Oh, what is it now?" "Another mutant hole, I bet," replied Danny. "Maybe." Norman slowly climbed down into the open chest and descended on the ladders. He landed lightly on the stone floor, and he found a stone staircase stretching down farther into the ground. Thankfully, Norman could see it send about 20 blocks down, so they wouldn't be walking an unknown distance. He turned to look behind him and saw Lizzie coming down into the hole. She landed and shouldered Shine, which was gleaming with the new polish. She peered over his shoulder with some difficulty to look at the staircase. "Oh, boy. I have a bad feeling about this, and I don't know why," she murmured softly. Norman slowly moved forward to make room for the other 7 people coming down. Norman suddenly wondered what Blackberry would be doing while they were down there in the ground. Norman crouched down and did his best to silence his footsteps as he crept down the staircase. As he went down the first half of the staircase, he started to hear voices. Some sounded complicated, some very calm, and about 2/3 of the way down he was able to make out the words. ... Bind our knowledge together, the proper logic would form with combined intelligence and answers would come with such effortlessness and time-saving capabilities. Ah yes, I couldn't have said it more adequately, Professor Pigson. Now, would anyone care for another spot of tea? Of course, Dr. Squidson. How can I oppose your generous offer? Norman kept walking, but even slower now. He didn't know who the people were down at the bottom of the staircase, but he wasn't willing to take any chances. He had bad experiences with the unknown factors of situations too many times in the past to not be careful. He watched a moving distorted shadow on the end of the staircase move as the person talked. Ah! That is excellent tea, if I do say so myself, Doctor. Now then, let's not become distracted. We still must focus on the question of how to teach the young and old minds of mobs everywhere. If they shall not listen to us, we must try new approaches. Of course. That is exactly why I proposed that we together formulate a proper and popular idea to express to the public by binding together our... Wait a moment. Norman put a hand to his mouth to silence his breath. The voices became silent, and Norman saw the distorted shadow on the wall move. Footsteps echoed through the room next to the staircase, and suddenly a figure emerged from behind the wall. Norman caught himself as he almost tripped over. Standing right below them on the landing was a pig. This pig was standing on its hind legs, holding a fine wooden cane with a gold cap. He wore a silk green-colored top hat and a monocle. Suddenly, it spoke. "And what do we have here?" A group of young chaps ready to explore the wondrous depths of logic and literature? Norman froze in place, staring at the anthropomorphic pig. He looked over his shoulder and saw everyone staring at the pig from behind, all with the same shocking look on their faces. What's with the talking bacon? Classic, Danny. Just classic. Norman thought to himself. Norman and the pig stared at each other for a few moments, but the pig broke the silence quickly. "Well, come on, then. We were just having some tea." The pig walked gracefully back into the side room. Norman cautiously followed the pig, and he suddenly found himself in a small, comfortably lit room. The room was fashioned out of junglewood planks, and glowstone was placed in 3 of the corners except the entrance to give the room enough light. Chairs, which strangely enough were unimplemented blocks, were set up around the room in a square, and all 4 but one were occupied. They were occupied by even more mobs. Norman saw a sheep with a monocle and silk top hat plus a cow and a chicken wearing the same. He looked to his left and saw a squid floating in a glass tank, and even it was wearing the same outfit. Norman slowly turned his head in time to see the pig sitting down in his chair. He also noticed that they were all holding gold canes, only each of them had a different gold top. The pig had a gold pork chop, then gold wool, gold leather, gold feather, and when he looked at the squid the top was a gold ink sac. The room wasn't exactly the biggest, so everyone took a while to squeeze inside. Once the whole group was inside, the pig gestured towards the ground. "Please, sit down and maybe you will find yourself more comfortable." Everyone sat down, but their eyes remained staring straight at the pig. The mob put both hooves on its cane and tapped it on the ground. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Professor Pigson. This here is Professor Sheepson, Professor Cowson, Professor Chickenson, and Dr. Squidson. We are the Society of Splendidly Knowledgeable Gentle Mobs, SOSKG for short. We direct the curious minds of young and old mobs to a knowledgeable and educated future. Also, our intellect, as you could imagine, is top-notch, as we must know how to lead and succeed with utmost certainty." Professor Pigson leaned forward in his chair and continued with a question. "And what has brought you here? Are you travelers?" he inquired. Norman fidgeted on the ground uncomfortably for a few seconds, but finally he answered. In a sort of sense, yes. But, we were just wandering through the plains. And we saw your little village, and we weren't sure what to do, so we just explored each house, and all of them but yours were empty. So, we're not really sure what we're doing here." It was the best Norman could explain. Professor Chickenson piped up from the side. He was small enough that he just clutched the gold top of his cane and it miraculously stood up for him to support himself on. "And what, if I must inquire, caused you to wander throughout the plains so unknowingly?" he declared in an almost suspicious tone. Norman's thoughts were running around through his head. Should he tell them what their quest is about? What if they turn out evil? Norman glanced up to see all the professors, and the one doctor, watching him. He decided he couldn't think up a good enough lie, so Norman had to tell them the truth. You won't tell anyone this, promise?" he asked. Professor Pigson put a hooved foot to his chest like a hand and said, "On a gentle mob's honor. We shall not tell a single soul of this meeting or anything related to such topics." Norman sighed and told himself that there was no going back now. "All right. We were sent on a quest to defeat the error. We need to find a way to the next mob clan and mutant. But, we do have a compass to guide us, but whenever we follow it we're always led the most direct route. As a result, the mob clan we face can easily spot us and kill us. What I'm trying to say is, we need to find a secret entrance into the next clan's hideout," he explained. Professor Cowson stood up and declared, "Well, why didn't you say so, my dear boy? We are the masters of knowledge and logic. May I see this compass of yours?" Norman nodded and unzipped his block pack, carefully bringing out the golden eye. Norman hadn't looked into the golden eye yet, but he was sure that they were either going to face the zombie clan or the skeleton clan. He hadn't done so because he wanted to make sure they didn't lead themselves unknowingly into the hideout while in plain view. That would have been a disaster. Norman handed the golden eye over to Professor Cowson and he grunted when he held it up to his eye. "It's got a bit of weight, doesn't it?" he commented. After about 10 seconds of looking through the golden eye, the professor put it down and held it in his lap. "According to this compass, you would be traveling through the nearby jungle into a hidden jungle temple deep inside. There lies the zombie clan and its mutant, Zombiulk. Although, using the abilities of logic, I can see that once seeing this you would walk directly through the entrance and be ambushed by zombie guards. All jungle temples are mostly underground, connected to dungeons with monster spawners. This means that there must be a mine shaft near the jungle temple you are looking for, and furthermore you could enter through a secret passage by finding the room of cobblestone and moss stone with a zombie monster spawner. By entering through a secret passage, you may be able to sneak past the zombie guards silently, as they are some of the lowest creatures in intelligence, and set off a trap to kill all the unsuspecting zombies and hopefully their leader. To sum up my thoughts, I propose that you travel underground whenever you are in the midst of the jungle nearby," he explained. Norman had a bit of trouble keeping up with his complicated voice, and a few seconds went by before Norman had processed everything that Professor Cowson had explained. Then he realized that there was still one flaw in his plan, so he spoke up. Professor, how are we going to know when we are under the jungle all the time? We might accidentally wander off underneath a desert without knowing." Professor Chickenson spoke up from the back of the room. Yes. I am delighted that you asked. I am an inventor, you see, and I am actually a super chicken mob that Notch created about 30 years ago. I have the highest intellect of this group, and using it I create fantastic inventions, just like Notch. I invented this one a couple of years ago, but I rarely ever used it. I've been waiting for someone to have the need for it, and I suppose that you are the perfect individual to use it," he declared. The professor flew up and popped the gold feather top off his cane, but the cane stayed standing still. Then squeezed down inside the revealed to be hollow cane and came back out with a small silver button. Not a coat button, but a button like on a piece of machinery. He tightened the gold cap back on the cane and then hopped towards Norman. He held out the button and Norman noticed that it had a letter and number printed in white on it. It read F3. This is the F3. Like the hotbar on your arm, when fixed into your skin, it never falls off. Being pressed causes the data of your existence to appear in front of you. Using this, you can tell where you are, so you'll never have to worry about not knowing whether you are underneath the jungle. Here, the procedure for surgery is really quite painless," said the professor. Professor Chickenson jumped and balanced himself on Norman's left arm, right above the hotbar. He then positioned the F3 on Norman's wrist, right next to his hotbar. Norman only felt a bit of a pinch, and then when Professor Chickenson let go of the F3, it was fastened seamlessly onto Norman's wrist. Norman moved around his hand in different directions, and was amazed at the F3's ability to flex and twist without breaking. He then took a finger and pressed down on the button, which clicked lower into place. Suddenly, a bunch of white numbers and data entries appeared before him. This is exactly what they read. Minecraft 91.4, 11 FPS, 1 chunk updates, used memory, 99%. C. 187 4624. F. 258, 0, 0. E. 4179, 999,999,999 megabytes. E. 118,